Hi, I'm Manda McKay. I'm a professional artist, and I've been making these videos to give you tips to help you enhance your creativity. And these tips are for any level of expertise, whether you're a professional artist or just starting out, or maybe you've even just picked up a creative hobby. Today, I'm going to be giving you a tip that really it's a tip that I use myself all the time, and it's very helpful when you're in the brainstorming process trying to come up with an idea. You have some idea in mind for a creative project, but maybe you're feeling kind of stuck about how you actually want to do it, how to proceed. So if you're in that situation, I want you to ask yourself, what is the absolute worst way I could do this? Now, I want to be sure to differentiate between what I'm talking about, where it would be at the brainstorming stage or coming up with just an idea of how you're going to do something, asking what's the worst way I can do this, compared to actually creating intentionally bad art, which would actually be the subject of another video that I'm going to do in the future. So for example, if you were trying to come up with a recipe, an innovative recipe for a birthday cake, if you were asking yourself, what's the absolute worst way I could do this, then you might think, add tuna to the recipe. Whereas if you were just trying to make intentionally bad art, that might be making the cake and burning it on purpose. So two different things. So, okay, let's say you are trying to come up with that birthday cake recipe and you do come up with add tuna to the birthday cake. Okay, that does sound nauseating, unless you're a walrus. Nobody wants to eat tuna in a birthday cake, I'm pretty sure. If you come up with a truly terrible idea like that, I want you to congratulate yourself, because you have freed up your brain from being self-conscious about coming up with ideas. Believe it or not, it is very easy, even if you're just brainstorming privately all by yourself and nobody's ever going to know about these ideas, people can still be very self-conscious that they're going to come up with really dumb ideas. So when you ask yourself, what is the worst idea for this, then you're getting past that self-consciousness, and you're more likely to be able to have this lead to coming up with some actually usable, good ideas. And of course, like anything having to do with creativity, practicing is important. So the more you practice this technique of just asking yourself, what's the worst way I can do this, the better you'll get at it. And it doesn't even have to be about something that you're working on, but maybe you're watching a sitcom and they've introduced some kind of a conflict, and you know that they're going to resolve that conflict within the next 15 minutes. But before they do, you could just take a second to ask yourself, what is the worst way that these characters could resolve this conflict? What is the absolute worst outcome, how they could do this? And just that kind of thing, and practice, and you will find it easier and easier to just kind of loosen up your brain with brainstorming and not be worried about censoring yourself. I'll give you a good example of when I use this myself. I do oil paintings predominantly. I do still lifes made of assembled natural objects. And I was trying to come up with an idea. I actually wanted to do a still life depicting the practice that some families do of abandoning baby girls because the family wanted a boy. So now, how do you show that in a still life? So I had already decided that I would use a pink flower to represent a baby girl. And yes, that's very obvious and basic, a pink flower for a girl. I did want my painting to be easily understood. But then I needed a second element to add to the still life where it would represent cruelty. And I didn't care whether it was something obvious or not. I couldn't think of anything to add to the still life. So that's where I asked myself, what is the worst way I could possibly show cruelty in the still life? And I came up with the idea of a feather, because a feather is something you think of as being very soft, right? So not really anything to show violence or cruelty. So that was a really bad idea. But then I thought about it, And that actually turned out to be a great idea in disguise, because especially if you have a very large feather, it does have the quill, the point on the end, and that's really sharp. And I wound up using a very large feather that I think came from a vulture. It was about 1.5 feet long, and it had a very strong, powerful, sharp end to it, and I used that to impale the pink flower, and I think it got my point across very well. Now, your terrible idea is probably not going to be a good idea in disguise, but at the very least, it will, like I said, it will help you kind of get past that self-consciousness and those this censoring yourself, so that you can be more likely to come up with a good idea. And when you get used to this, I don't always ask myself, what's the worst way I can do something? I might say, what's the most ridiculous way? What's the most radical way? What's the most provocative way? As you get better at using this technique, you can kind of tweak it to whatever you need at the time that makes the most sense. But I think, especially if you're starting out, just ask yourself, what is the absolute worst way, the worst idea possible? And that will at least get you started thinking. So let's revisit the idea of the terrible birthday cake with tuna in it. Okay, again, really vomit-inducing probably to have a cake with that in it, but is there something okay, so let's think about the tuna would be something savory. Maybe there's a different savory element that you could use that wouldn't be quite as bad as tuna. Maybe you could use cheddar cheese somehow, Doritos ground up, maybe even mushroom powder, I don't know. And my apologies if these are really obvious things. I don't bake, so maybe people do this kind of thing all the time. And like I said, my apologies if everybody's already doing this. But you know, maybe you can come up with a way to use one of these elements to have something savory in the cake. That would be very unexpected. And okay, maybe savory, maybe that's not gonna work. Well, what about sour or salty? You know, maybe just thinking about why you came up with tuna would lead you to think about some other, you know, adding a sour element or a salty element. And then maybe you just decide that, okay, none of these are going to work. But then you decide to add mint to it, and maybe that's a little bit unexpected for a birthday cake. Again, I'm not really sure. But if you come up with something like that, maybe you wouldn't have even gotten to that point if you hadn't let yourself come up with the idea of tuna first. You might have just given up trying to only come up with great ideas and then just been like, okay, I can't do this, and then just use the same recipe that you've always used. So that's the beauty of this technique, and saying, what is the absolute worst way I could do this? And that would be the most likely to just kind of free your mind, where you're not self-conscious and you can think of something, you know, come up with something terrible, and then maybe you'll come up with something good. And again, practicing this really helps. So give this a try, and just, you know, when you're stuck, just say, what is the worst way I could do this? What is my worst idea possible? And I think you'll find that it's actually an extremely useful technique. And like I said, it's one that I use a lot. I use it all the time. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, like and subscribe, or tell me in the comments if it worked out for you or maybe it didn't. I'd be really interested to hear how it's working for other people. Again, my name is Manda McKay. Thank you for watching.